I think one of the trends we've seen over the last 9 years that ISSOTL has existed is a beginning to get some common understanding of some of the boundaries of it. In the early days, I think there were many more differences. There's at least recognition of those differences and acceptance of them in the early days, and it's still there for some people as they come new into the area. They say, oh, it must be this. And I think if ISSOTL's taught us anything, it's to value the variation there. I think that's particularly true actually for people in the United States. It's a big country, it's where SoTL started, and you know, the most of the work has been done there. But there are other things happening elsewhere in the world, and I think sometimes people in the US are a little insular, and I don't mean that in a negative sense, but I want to open them up to other ideas from outside. And if you look at the literature on SoTL, the ideas which are commonly cited in the US tends to be other US literature, there's a challenge, I think, for people there to see beyond the US literature and to see other ideas which are discussed and are common elsewhere.
Another area that was the theme of the opening plenary of the 2012 ISSOTL, and has been a theme throughout, has been what it means to internationalize this work. That is a very interesting question. For a long period of time now, the scholarship of teaching and learning under that name has been an Anglophone enterprise. And that, by Anglophone, I am being broad in my sense of what English, it doesn't mean that English is the native language of the country in concern, but it's one where it is a common academic language, or at least common enough that there's a body of people who can participate in it, come to our conferences, which are in English. We have people from Hong Kong who've long been part of this for understandable historical reasons. But we also have had contingents from Japan and from Sweden and some other countries, but we are still looking to how to make those bridges to what's going on in Europe, including former Eastern Europe, but also Western Europe. We don't have too many people here from France or Germany or Italy, or we occasionally get people from Portugal, but it's still, we need to make those bridges with what's going on there. We need to make bridges to Latin America and other parts of the world, and I think we can do that. But we are learning and contemplating where the blocks to those kinds of interactions are right now, and what would be the right forums for doing it, what would be the right topics. It's a very interesting problem, and one that we have a long way to go, even though we are an international movement and very much aware of it. But our region is somewhat restricted still, and we would like to expand that so that we can learn from them and just expand the number of perspectives available to us.
I have encountered scholarship of teaching and learning in two or three different cultural contexts. I think the countries like the UK or Australia that share the traditional British view of scholarship tend to be on the end of the continuum that values as rigorous social science and approach as possible, and in particular the publication of the work in conventional outlets. In the United States, there's more diversity about that, and occasionally you'll find some people from the UK who will be dismissive of the kind of work done in the US. There's also a difference in not just in rigor of methods, but in the connection to prior work. Some scholarly traditions demand that you begin with a full literature review of everything ever done before you do anything. And that can be a barrier to getting people started. If I asked my colleagues to first take 2 graduate courses in theory of education before they're allowed to touch their teaching, I wouldn't get many participants. So for pragmatic reasons, I urge them to engage in the examination of their own evidence, and then, as in problem-based learning, say, well, why don't you later, now that you're interested in it, why don't you go learn what others have done? And I find that that's a more natural path.
I think local variations are based on the nature of the institution. At a research institution, Research One institution like my own, we don't try to make the sell, except in certain areas, that this work is the same as disciplinary research. We use it as a way to explain someone's ability or improvement or trajectory in their teaching career. And so it might be something that you aspire to as you develop as a teacher. Okay. Clearly at smaller liberal arts colleges or comprehensive institutions, this changes. And I know of many institutions where it has become part of the dossier for research and promotion. So I think the institutional context is really important to answer that question.
I've been lucky enough to gallivant a bit around the world and see how SoTL plays out in different places. And that's been wonderfully educational. The similarities significantly outnumber the differences. I shouldn't be surprised by that anymore, but I continue to be in my own naive way. The similarities are related to a number of the other things we've been talking about. People working either in isolation or in small groups, or in some cases thinking they're working in isolation or small groups, but then when somebody at a higher level starts to bring the picture together, you realize, whoa, there are many of us here. At the University of British Columbia, when we did an informal survey of how much SoTL was being done just at the time when our institute was started, we had even with a small response rate, we found that a little over $5.5 million was going to the support of SoTL. Now, compared to other research, like hundreds of millions on campus, it's not very much, but I think that surprised a lot of people. And so we might not be as alone as we think. That I bet you could have that conversation anywhere. I've had it with people in Australia, I've had it in the UK, I've had it in Singapore, I've had it in places in South America. And other parts of Asia, Hong Kong, for example. So this idea that you're not as alone as you think, yet you probably are more alone than you should be, that's one universal. How do things play out differently? Well, one way for me that they play out differently is explained by the differing degrees of involvement at national levels in higher education. So if we contrasted the United States, where states, and in some cases individual institutions, have considerable say over what goes on there, the metrics they use to brag about, to determine whether they're succeeding, who gets in, who leaves, the language of tenure and promotion, it can come down to, gosh, even units within universities, and within states. And in Canada, it's very similar. Our federal government has very little say. They transfer funds to the provinces, and it's up to the provinces to use those funds. So we don't have national agendas, and we don't have national marching orders for our SoTL. Compare that to Australia, and to a certain extent to the UK, and you'll see major differences. The UK comes up with large sums of money, not as large as they once were, but nevertheless, by Canadian standards, large sums of money in a granting program, essentially for SoTL research. And they dictate to a certain extent what the topic of choice can be. So nationally, there are topics decided upon and initiatives started, which means that, in my experience, across Australian universities, you see more interinstitutional cooperation in SoTL research. It's easier, I believe, in Australia to collect things like national levels of data. My Australian colleague should comment on that, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. So the idea of where SoTL fits politically and where the motivation and what I would call, not quite tongue-in-cheek, the marching orders come from are really very different depending on where you land.
The other cultural difference that I've started to notice was something that was related to the talk yesterday. There were two phrases that were used. One is pedagogical colonialism and pedagogical tourism. And so as countries that have had a very traditional, heavily didactic educational tradition, professors talk, students say nothing. They write what they were told, they memorize it. If they learn and remember enough of it, they get a degree. That kind of community doesn't have a tradition of convening about teaching. Teaching is obvious. You lecture. And so the way in which we interact with those communities, I think, will be very interesting. We seem to be inviting some pedagogical tourism as people come to this meeting or go for a couple of weeks and visit universities in other countries. I'm hoping we will avoid pedagogical colonialism, that we won't arrive as the experts and say, you know, here's how to change your life so you do it the right way. But we'll have the good sense to convene those colleagues to explore their own, and when they identify challenges, invite them to consider other alternatives, which maybe even violate their expectations. They may bring someone from the ISSOTL community in to tell them what to do. And even if they want you to tell them what to do, I think it's important that we not do that, though that will create its own little mini tensions.
I think in my context, which is the Swedish higher education system, we've tried to build in a combination of SoTL work being an individual enterprise for individual academic teachers in order to discover more things about their students' learning, but also a component of that being part of organizational change, so changing the teaching culture within the organization on the basis of those inquiries into student learning within different disciplines. And I think that might differ from how some other contexts experience or perceive of SoTL work, where it's more of an individual enterprise rather than the combination of the two.
SoTL is not very big in Europe, so there will be differences, and there are also these differences concerning concepts or terms that we use. So every now and then people do not understand if we, use the North American concepts, like talking about faculty instead of academic staff or academics. That might be very confusing. So in Europe, I think that SoTL is it's bigger in UK than in what is called mainland Europe, where I live. But it's getting there. But there are also several organizations or networks in Europe that could be compared to SoTL, that work in the same area and in with the same problems and challenges.
Faculty in the USA and I think in Canada means what staff means in South Africa. So in South Africa, faculty is a group of departments. It's a structural organization thing, and staff is what the USA call faculty.
Having come to two conferences, I think that we're way behind. In Singapore, we really are way behind in, trying to develop academic staff. And now, this conference was about working with students as co-designers, collaborators. That's a brand new idea for me. It really has blown me away. So I think we have a long way to go. You know, I think the climate in Singapore is not that students or even peers, you know, we're not really that collaborative. And this year I've been involved with the collaborative writing group, and that has just been amazing, really amazing experience, because I wouldn't experience that in my own institution.
So in Norway, that can be described very easily, because there are, I think we are 2 people from my university, and there might be 1 person in addition, but that's it. I think there are more Swedes. I've met 1 Dane, so we are very few. We were 5 Norwegians in Liverpool, so that was more, but it's. I think that if ISSOTL is really going to, you know, have the name of being international, then there has got to be more work on the international side of it, because it's very dominated from the North American countries, and that's fine, but there are also other regions and continents.
SoTL characteristics in South Africa particularly, I can relate that to this morning's plenary session where we talked about engaging the student in teaching and learning and planning teaching and learning. In South Africa, that is something that we don't have to try and work into the thing. It's absolutely critical that you bring the student into making sure that the teaching is effective. Because in South Africa, the students come from very different backgrounds, and our schooling system is really quite a problem at the moment. So when students enter university, it's critical for lecturers to really be on the level or make sure that they know what the level of the student is and that they are getting through to the student. So I think just the diversity of the student community in South Africa, and because students come from various backgrounds in terms of language, in terms of income groups, and in terms of educational background, that really makes student engagement absolutely critical.
There are some differences, and there are also, of course, language problems, and so it's that might be one of the reasons why fewer Europeans attend conferences, because it takes people longer to develop a paper, for example, to come to a conference. So that's the main point, I think.
I think for SoTL to be meaningful in other parts of the world that are not English-speaking, the 2 things I would at this moment point to is that fundamentally there has to be some type of professional development available for teachers of all levels, not just young career scholars, but all teachers, because really without it there is no chance to really reflect about your own practice and to have this really critical reflection which you need, which is a starting point, and to know what you might want to investigate. So this professional development is necessary. Academic development or faculty development has to exist, so that people can develop some level of pedagogical competence, because professors, well, are not born, you know, great teachers and great reflective practitioners, though they have very advanced skills in research usually. So that's one thing. But the other thing, quite different, is that there has to be leadership. There has to be some notion of institutional leadership, and also at the same time what I would call pedagogical autonomy of the teachers. So they can't be too constrained by institutions, higher education systems, by managers. They have to be able to really design their own teaching, choose student assignments that may be totally non-traditional. They have to have that autonomy to try new things, because that is often how these investigations start. They start in the classroom when academic teachers decide to do something differently and see how that might affect their students' learning.
I think one of the basic issues that could be good to be aware of is that people do interpret SoTL in very different ways. And since people at this conference come from different institutions, different countries, different disciplinary backgrounds, and we usually have quite sort of limited space to go into depth into discussions, you might find that sometimes you misinterpret things because you think you're talking about the same thing, but you're actually not. But again, it's a very inclusive society. It's a very friendly network, a very friendly arena, lots of people to learn new things from and get inspired by. And there's no one who would actually threaten or sort of not be willing to continue a conversation and go into depth about what we mean by certain concepts.
As I think about the kind of hunger there is for higher education around the world, you know, when I come to a conference in different parts of the world on higher education, it seems like we're hearing the same tape being replayed again and again. It's the same concerns. It's the same issues, because we are, after all, humans. We just happen to be geographically in different places. What is not happening is that we don't have enough of these conversations at a global level where we can learn from the evolution or whatever stage we're at in these conversations. And it is precisely an organization like ISSOTL, which is international, which must bridge these conversations in a way so that they don't belong to any particular country. And I would say this is easier said than done. You know, when we say international and we only represent maybe a few continents and not the most populous ones, then the claim may be one that is more aspirational than real. And I think there is much we can do in trying to create a place, you know, a space would even be a better way to think about this, where we have regular conversations with not just academics, but let's bring in the other thought leaders from whether it is folks who are from industry, whether they are politicians, whether they are policy makers, whomever has influence on the lives of our learners. They need to be part of this conversation, and we have a role to play in bringing them together and creating, designing environments where conversations like these would flourish.
I think the variations internationally with SoTL are this, is the structure of the institution itself, where you have faculty in the United States, you have academic staff and international. So the language itself is an interesting area as we try to define our terms, as we try to define what does it mean to teach in a class where I have autonomy and someone in an international setting might be working for the full professor who designs the total course and they have no authority or autonomy to change that course. Some similarities are that we're all interested in the idea about student learning. How do we enhance it? How do we make students go out of our classroom engaged, anxious to find out more, wanting to come back and engage in our love for the discipline that we're in? So I don't think that changes across international borders at all.